Welcome to episode 45 of the How to Japanese podcast for November 2023. I'm Daniel Morales. This month, the main part of the podcast will include a major spoiler for the latest John Wick movie, John Wick Chapter 4. So I'm going to front load some of the random content that I would normally talk about at the end of the podcast. And then I'll give a spoiler warning for those of you who want to avoid hearing anything about the movie, even though it's really just kind of a minor detail, to be honest, or I would argue it's a minor detail. Even though it's a major detail, I don't know. We'll see. So at the front of the show, these are just the random kind of one-off comments that I would make. But my first is that the nerds have won. Congratulations, everyone. I think we won. So I was back in the U.S. at the beginning of this month. I was visiting family, but I also stopped by Los Angeles to hang out with a friend that I've known since kindergarten. And we went to a comic book shop, that's what I would have called it if it was a place where I was going when I was growing up back in the 90s. We went to the comic book shop, and there was one that was so kind of dingy and dirty, and there must have been some kind of questionable content there because my mom stopped letting me go there. But what I mostly remember it as is a very narrow building with just extremely small spaces filled with comic books, basically a kind of shop front along Magazine Street in New Orleans that had three aisles, and they went really high, or they seemed like they went really high. And I think it was called the Gold Mine or something like that. It was on Magazine, just past Napoleon, between Napoleon and Louisiana. And we used to go there. They had a corner that had 25-cent comics, and man, it's really a blast from the past. But when I was on the trip, I also went past More Fun Comics, which is still around over on Oak Street, and it's just a very typical comic shop. It's just, nothing that special, I would say. They were nice enough. It's still around. I'm sure it must have changed. The owners must have changed hands. I don't know, maybe not. But this one that I went to in LA was in a nice neighborhood. I don't know LA very well, but it wasn't in Hollywood. It wasn't in the Palisades or anything like that. This was in a decent neighborhood, but you go in and it was a total weird vibe shift when you went in, and it was quiet, and it was well lit, and it was full of pinball machines. I don't think they had arcade machines, but arcade games, but they had pinball machines, and just tons and tons of comics, trade paperbacks, novels, sci-fi novels, things like that. Coolers full of obscure cola and probably CBD drinks, I would guess. And I don't think it really fits into the same category as comic book shop. If you Google it online, it's called Revenge of in Los Angeles, and they call it a lifestyle store, which I think is probably kind of more appropriate to what it's offering. And it just made me think that the nerds have won. We won. Everything that we liked growing up that was considered uncool is now completely and profoundly mundane and normal, I would say. So everything that was kind of niche and obscure, and those are polite words for what I think other people would have called us then. I think words that I won't use, and words that were written on people's notebooks and pencil cases, things like that were written on mine by people at my high school. And but now, life is a long game, and I think it's kind of cool and a bit of a relief to see that, even people like Michael B. Jordan, who's a huge Naruto fan, and there's a player on the New Orleans Saints football team who's hugely into anime and things like that. So it's all extremely normal. And to see something like this store and to see that it's I guess surviving and thriving even in the era of online sales and Amazon, is kind of nice and very cool to see uh, that the nerds have basically won. So let's keep winning and keep supporting writers, authors, artists, things like that. The other thought that I had this month is one that I just had like literally yesterday because I started playing Sekiro this weekend. So I was basically addicted to Elden Ring, and I'm still playing a lot of co-op actually. But I've been seeing some people streaming Sekiro on TikTok, and it looked cool. It looked, pretty similar to Elden Ring, but so I wanted to give it a shot. Borrowed it from a friend at work, and immediately realized it's not the same kind of game. It's much, much more difficult. I do like how light and agile you feel as a character in the game compared to Elden Ring, where everything is a bit like weightier and difficult to control. Uh, but the real reason I mention it here is because it reminds me of Automatic Eve, which is a collection of short stories set in a fictional version of Bakufu era Japan by the author Inui Rokuro. Um, it came out in Japanese in 2014 and it was translated into English by Matt Trevod in 2019. I reviewed it for the Japan Times in early 2020, I think spring 2020, so probably about 6 months after it came out. And Sekiro reminded me of it because karakuri, Japanese kind of mechanized puppets, automatons, play a really significant role. In the game, your character, I don't think this really isn't a spoiler, but it's just a main plot point that your character has a karakuri arm. And so it's made of wood, kind of like, all these kind of finely tuned mechanized pieces that the character can then use as like a grappling hook. So it kind of creates this way to have interesting traversal in a universe that would otherwise be extremely grounded because it's samurai era Japan. Um, in Automatic Eve, the central conceit of the book is that karakuri is a kind of cybernetics slash artificial intelligence. And Inui, the author, uses it to kind of ask the same questions that writers of science fiction ask. What is human existence? Where do you draw the line between kind of computer and artificial intelligence and like self-realization? And it really made me wonder whether people at From Software making this game had read Automatic Eve and were inspired by it because 2014 and Sekiro comes out so Sekiro came out in 2019 and made me wonder. They had assuming that Sekiro was in development for 3 years at least, then there were a couple years there where there was a good chance that somebody at From Software uh, was reading this, or perhaps I'm not quite as familiar with that genre as I should be. Maybe there's a lot more content other than just Inui's book that is kind of making that same connection between karakuri and the potential to build up to AI level automatons, because essentially that's kind of what a lot of those karakuri are. They're these mechanized like animals or human type things that you wind up and then they kind of do something in little patterns and things like that. And so it's not too far of a leap to see how you could go from that to saying, okay, well, maybe there's a way to kind of make that into something more than just a simple robot. And that, I mean, you have to go read this book, Automatic Eve. It's one of the best books I've ever read. It's easily and one of the best translations. Matt Trevod's translation is just incredible and engrossing and seamless. With a lot of translations, you can kind of see what the Japanese is doing sometimes, I think, and with that one you can't. It's perfect. It's great, and you're going to fly through it because, I mean, one, because it's short stories. It creates these kind of natural resting points, and the kind of um, give and take of the story, the ebb and flow, the flow of the story is much faster than a novel would be. The development and the first half of the stories are much shorter than the second half, which kind of build towards that kind of linked story and um, the eventual conclusion, which is just fantastic. And actually, unfortunately, it's a trilogy in Japanese. There are two additional books. I've read a part of the second one, which is set in a fictional version of Chicago and clearly inspired by A Devil in the White City, which, if you haven't read it, is a um, book of popular history about the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which was held in 1893. And you may or may not be aware that that inspired the kind of aesthetic of Bioshock Infinite. So it's this kind of very, not Baroque, but very heavily decorated, grand architecture with a lot of grandeur in it. And a lot of people say that, Frank Lloyd Wright was kind of like responding to that style, but they built this huge area in Midway area of Chicago, which is down in Hyde Park now, with all these kind of like temporary buildings built in that style of that you see all these buildings in Bioshock Infinite. I can't remember the name of the city in that game, but um, it's pretty incredible. And there's this story of a serial killer that happened during the fair, and Inui uses that to kind of um, basically create one of the storylines in that book, and it ties into the first novel as well. I really need to finish that book. The third book, I don't know where it takes place, but unfortunately, the imprint that translated the novel, I don't think is no longer in operation, unfortunately. So I don't know if there's any hope that we get that book. Unfortunately, the second one wasn't quite as good. It didn't really pull me through the book, although I mean, it's much easier when you're reading it in your native language, I would say, to kind of get to that point where you're being drawn through a fictional experience. But it wasn't bad. It was interesting. I need to kind of yeah, I need to go back and read it and finish it up so that I can get to the third one. Okay, so that's all my comments I had with kind of random stuff, and so now I want to get to the core of this month's post, which is about collocations, which I'll get to the definition of in a minute. But as I mentioned, there will be a spoiler for the latest John Wick movie, John Wick Chapter 4. It came out in the US, I think, much earlier this year. If I can't remember exactly when, but it didn't come out in Japan until September, late September. And then I didn't get a chance to see it until late October, right before my trip home. And so I'm only now kind of like digesting it. And the movie was okay. It was only okay. I think the first John Wick is really special, I would say. I mean, all the other ones are fun and kind of exciting and great in terms of the kind of um, visual experience that it creates. Especially if you're into gun fu and the kind of Chow Yun Fat, John Woo style of movie. But I think in terms of kind of creating an interesting fictional universe that really felt unique in the same way that The Matrix felt unique when it first came out and kind of special, really only the first movie was a 100% success, I would say. Um, and I say that to also to note that I watched a subtitled version, and none of the subtitles really stand out to me now that I look back on it, except for one of the very last ones. And this is the spoiler. The spoiler is that John Wick finally dies in this movie. This is the last of the mainline John Wick movies, or we are supposed to think that, I would say, because one of the final shots is of his gravestone, and you see John Wick's grave right next to his wife's grave, And on them, it reads just their names and loving husband, loving wife. And this is a reference to earlier in the movie when Wake is parting ways with Winston Scott, the manager of the New York Continental Hotel, who's that actor from Deadwood. I can't remember his name, but British guy who plays the innkeep in Deadwood, and runs the hotel and is kind of one of the main through characters through all four movies. Um, he's talking about the gravestone for one of the managers, or the other managers at the hotel. And when John Wick leaves him to go do a duel, he says, "Loving husband, that's what I want on mine." Um, and I don't remember what the subtitle for that conversation was, but I like to assume that the translator was basically did a decent job of kind of connecting that scene to the final scene at the cemetery. And when the gravestones pop up, there are subtitles under each of them, and it's "Tsuma o aisuru otto," and so a husband who loves his wife, and "Otto o aisuru tsuma." And so I'll read those again. "Tsuma o aisuru otto. Otto o aisuru tsuma." So when I saw this, it made me kind of tilt my head a little bit. I was kind of like, I guess that's okay, but it doesn't do the same thing as the English. And the reason why is because loving husband is a collocation and the Japanese is not. Loving husband is a phrase that you hear all the time. Loving wife, also a phrase that you hear all the time. If you look in a dictionary under husband, loving husband will be one of the examples, especially if you look in a collocation dictionary. But in Japanese, tsuma o aisuru otto and otto o aisuru tsuma is just a literal translation of what this translator's interpretation of loving husband means. It feels to me when I see this, it literally means husband who loves his wife, wife who loves her husband. It feels more kind of unidirectional and not quite as expansive. It leaves out maybe possibilities that the English includes. So yes, loving husband does mean it's a love for a spouse, but it's also maybe indirectly love for a spouse rather than just this kind of unilateral "I love you." It's caring, warmth. It's taking care of the house, the kids, things like that. That maybe isn't necessarily implied as much by the Japanese here, which is maybe ironic given that Japanese is kind of always thought of as this very concise language. Here is some English that is incredibly concise, in a way that the Japanese translation is not. And the reason why, again, is this word collocation that I keep saying. It's a little bit of a tricky word to define. And here are two definitions. Merriam-Webster says it's a noticeable arrangement of or conjoining of linguistic elements such as words, which is too vague in my book. A noticeable arrangement is so it's a group of words that you notice together. Basically, that's what it's Merriam-Webster's is saying. Cambridge, on the other hand, gets really, really specific and nails things down more precisely. And I kind of like what they do here. They say it's a word or phrase that is often used with another word or phrase in a way that sounds correct to people who have spoken the language all their lives, but might not be expected from the meaning. So it's kind of saying a collocation is a group of words that create a sum that is greater than their parts. So the example they use is a hard frost. Native English speakers know that a hard frost means when it freezes to below the freezing point and stays that way. Whereas a soft frost would be a frost where maybe you're getting some frost on the grass, but then during the day it's getting back up into the 40s or 50s or something like that. And so it's idiomatic phrasing in a way, but not necessarily always an idiom. So loving husband, for example, is a collocation that might not be an idiom. And so now the definition in Japanese, Japanese uses the word in katakana, korokeishon, is generally the way you see it. And especially when you're looking at dictionaries, korokeishon jiten is the general way you say collocation dictionary. And in the newsletter this month, I took a look at two definitions of collocation in Japanese. I'll read one of them now from the digital Daijisen, and that definition is 二つ以上の単語の関与的なつながり。二つ以上の単語の関与的なつながり which is an idiomatic connection between two or more words. And then it adds the phrase 連合関係, 連合関係. And that word right there, 連合, 連合. 連合 is the ren from renraku and the go from gengo. Rengo is basically the word for Japanese word for collocation, and you can see that it means basically a connected word, connected phrase. And so that's what a collocation is. It's words that get used together frequently. A hard frost, a loving husband. It's the scales falling off my eyes. The scales fall from my eyes. Right. That's a collocation, and I would say borderline idiom that comes from the Bible. And so because the English is this collocation, we have all this kind of embedded meaning associated with it, whereas the Japanese is really just a kind of direct translation that isn't quite as living of a phrase. And you can tell this immediately by looking at the Google search results. It's obviously Google search results can provide, mixed results here and there. But here it's kind of glaring. If you search for loving husband in brackets, you get 9,510,000 hits, which is a huge amount. It's a very normal phrase. Whereas if you put tsuma o aisuru otto in quotations and search for it, you get 17,900. So this isn't, a Google bang, which is a search that gets one hit. But it's also not a kind of everyday part of the language. The other option that I thought might be a kind of natural phrase is ito-oshii otto. Ito-oshii is a kind of word that means like loving, dear. It's an adjective form of the verb ai. Of the word ai. So love, aisuru, that ai and aisuru is the adjective form is ito-oshii. And if you put that in quotes, you only get 5,550 hits. So that's even less frequent and feels kind of like an attempt at a forced collocation, an unnatural collocation that I was kind of thinking that might be the way you say it. That might be something that would be an approximate collocation, but it also popped up on Weblio. If you know Weblio, you know that it also has a lot of suspect translation possibilities. So that's something to think about. But I think the disparity between the search results shows that Sumo Aisuru Otto is not a perfect translation in some senses, right? But I started wondering, like, what are the other options, right? Obviously, ito shi otto, not a good one either. So if there's really no kind of equivalent natural collocation in Japanese, and I checked in the one collocation dictionary I have, which is from Gakken. It's called Japanese Collocation Dictionary. But I guess the Japanese title is, let's see, I don't know, it's got this extra language on it that says, 知っておきたい日本語結びついた言葉. That might be just a subtitle, but the Gakken Kodokeishon Jiten doesn't include any options for Otto, unfortunately. The way that most of these dictionaries works is that it's listed by noun, at least this one is. It lists a bunch of different nouns, and then it will show you kind of what adjectives, what verbs go with these nouns frequently. And so Here, there's no otto option, unfortunately. And I think, the Weblio search shows that if itoshi otto is as close as we can get, there's really nothing that's an equivalent collocation. So what else could the translator have done? One thing might be finding an equivalent Japanese gravestone phrase and using that. What could you replace? What do Japanese use on their gravestones that could be a potential equivalent? But again, that's not a good solution. Japanese don't usually write messages on their gravestones, at least not quite as frequently as maybe people in the US. One thing that immediately comes to mind is there's someone on TikTok who's going around and cooking all the recipes from gravestones. People put recipes on their favorite recipes on their gravestones. And this, I can't remember who the content creator is, but if you Google it, I'm sure it will pop up. This person is going around and cooking them all. You're not going to find a recipe on a gravestone in Japan, at least not enough to make a TikTok page full of gravestone recipes. You often will see the name, especially the family name, sometimes the posthumous Buddhist name, their sect of Buddhism. If they do write a phrase, I Googled a little bit, did a little bit of research, and found that it's generally simple phrases, something like arigato, thank you, or yasuraka ni, which is the in peace, that is implying rest in peace. Or you might see single character kanji like kokoro or ai. I'm not an expert on Japanese cemeteries, but I have wandered around at least one of them. I wandered around Tamareien, which is Tama Cemetery, out in the western part of Tokyo. I went there last July, right before I moved to Osaka, because it's where the Okamoto family is buried, and I'm interested in the writer Okamoto Kanoko, and I'm also interested in her son Okamoto Taro, who's basically the Japanese equivalent of Pablo Picasso. If Pablo Picasso was born maybe like 10 to 20 years later and lived like 10 to 20 years longer, and even he's this kind of like flamboyant artist, was lived a very, very public life, and even on his grave it only has he and his wife's name, and although he does have one of his sculptures on it, but his mother's grave and his father's grave are right nearby. His mother was a writer, his father was a cartoonist for the newspaper, his mother was also a kind of Buddhist scholar, so her grave has a Buddhist statue on it, and I think her father's grave, his father's grave, just has his father's name on it. So even with people who you might expect to do something a little bit more interesting or have some kind of comment, it's usually very simple. So if that's not an option, right? If we have no collocation, we have no kind of like practical equivalent. One option would be just to leave it in English. You could provide the katakana pronunciation of the English words, for example. I wondered about that. So that would be, labingu husbando, which sounds a little bit silly, I think. But I think not a terrible option. And actually, I was looking around on YouTube to kind of like remind myself of what these scenes were like. And I found a dubbed version of the movie. I'm a little bit embarrassed because I couldn't recognize what language it is, but I put a link in the newsletter. If you know what language it is, please let me know. But it's very clearly the scene with the hotel guy and John Wick. It's in this other language. If you don't speak it or don't know what it is, it just sounds, like a foreign language. And then all of a sudden you hear loving husband. And they just left that in English because I think the translator there kind of smartly recognized that there's nothing I can do with this, but my audience will likely recognize the words loving husband, and so I'm going to leave it like that. So I thought that was an interesting and smart way to handle it. A little bit more difficult with subtitles. I would be very curious to know what the dub translator in Japanese did, because often the subtitle translation and dub translation are very different. So if you saw the dubbed version of John Wick in Japan, let me know what that was like. I could probably rent the Blu-ray. Maybe I'll do that and watch the dub version and report back. But if you happen to see it, let me know and I'll update this. So I do think the translator did the best they could. The direct translation really is, I think, the best option here. So what we got, Tsuma wo aisuru otto, is probably fine. I think it's if you think of it as an explanatory footnote rather than a subtitle or a translation, then I think it makes a lot more sense. And that's really all it needed to do there, especially given that a lot of people in a Japanese audience, at least, are going to be able to understand Loving Husband to a certain extent when they see it on the gravestone, even if they're not understanding it when Keanu Reeves is saying it. When they see it at the end there, maybe it's got a little bit more of an impact. And then they get this direct translation and it kind of like creates this kind of synergetic full experience, which is kind of interesting. So that said, collocations are, I think, a really effective way to look at the language and always really reassuring for me because it's a reminder that when we go out the door every day into our life in Japanese, whether that's actually in Japan or in a classroom or just through an email message to a friend or a chat to a friend in Japanese, we don't have to reinvent the Japanese language. We don't have to reinvent grammar patterns. We don't have to reinvent phrases. We don't do that with English, and there's no way we should be doing that with a second language. We need to be borrowing accurate natural phrases at every possible moment we can. That means we're using good natural speech patterns. And so I thought I'd read a few examples. I used just one example one additional example in the newsletter this month, and that is with totemo. I was kind of reading through my collocation dictionary looking for good examples, but totemo I thought was a really interesting example because the collocation they give is totemo janai. Totemo janai ga. Totemo janai ga. And I'm sure at some point when I was studying Japanese and early in my translation career, I would have translated that kind of like unthinkingly as not very much, right? Totemo is used as this adjective, like totemo ureshii desu. I'm very happy, or totemo oishii desu. It's very delicious. And so totemo janai, obviously the basic negation. You might think, well, it's not very much, but the collocation dictionary quickly disabuses us of this notion. It says the definition is do yatte mo. So however we try it, right? And so here's the example sentence they give. It is totemo janai ga sonna takai kuruma wa kaenai. Totemo janai ga sonna takai kuruma wa kaenai. So there's no possible way I could afford to buy such a car. There's no possible way I could buy such an expensive car. And it adds a little note that says totemo o kyochou shita iikata. So it's emphasizing the totemo here. So I thought that was a really interesting phrase because, this is almost an exact definition of the Cambridge definition of collocation, right? Like it's, what did they say? They said it is, let's see, it sounds correct to people who have spoken the language all their lives, but might not be expected from the meaning. So obviously to us second language learners, we might not be expecting this meaning, but to native speakers, they know exactly what it means. Other collocations include all the keys, right? All the different usages of ki that you can ever think of. Ki ga ao, ki ga aru, ki ga ii, ki ga oi, ki ga oki, ki ga okenai, ki ga omoi, ki ga katsu, ki ga kiku, ki ga sasu, ki ga shirenai, ki ga sumu, ki ga seku, ki ga tatsu, ki ga tsuku, ki ga tsumaru, right? Ki ga toku naru, ki ga nagai, ki ga nai, right? There's 3 or 4 pages of keys with this, which is awesome. And I wouldn't recommend like reading it straight through, but keeping it on hand for when you need to kind of be reminded of it is extremely useful. And I like the way that Gakken is structured because the definitions are nice and short and easy to understand in Japanese, right? It's not like a long, obscure dictionary definition. They're relatively short and they include one example sentence, which I think are all also extremely clear. Also, other examples are that I wanted to point out. One, for example, that comes from English, one that I mentioned earlier on purpose, the scales fall from my eyes, right? The biblical idiom, collocation. And in Japanese, that is, me kara uroko ga ochiru. One more time, let's do that. One more time, me kara uroko ga ochiru. So literally, from my eyes, the scales fall. And it gives a definition. 何かをきっかけにしてわからなかったことが急にわかるようになる。何かをきっかけにしてわからなかったことが急にわかるようになる。Right, so for with some inspiration, you suddenly realize something that you didn't know before. And the example sentence they give is 先生のその一言を聞いて目から鱗が落ちる思いがした。So, great example sentences like that. And even just regular basic phrases. Here's another example. 酔いが覚める。酔いが覚める. And that just means to sober up. It's a very natural idiom, collocation that is just the kind of way that you use language, a natural speech pattern that is good to know and that you don't always recognize immediately. And that's really the first step, is to kind of take a step back and realize, hey, wait a second, maybe I don't understand what the language is doing here. Maybe it seems like something I should understand, but I'm not understanding it. So let me take a minute and see what this is actually doing. Often the times that in translation, most recently, that I've kind of nearly gotten myself in trouble is when I didn't take a minute to kind of Google a phrase in Japanese. And inevitably, the ones that trouble me the most these days are the ones that only have Japanese explanations, that don't have much English language dictionary coverage or online questioning from students of Japanese. But those are always the most fun to look up, too, because you're looking at Japanese sources, Japanese example sentences. I'm digging around on Japanese Twitter to see how people are using it. And fun websites like Chiebukuro, Yahoo Chiebukuro, which is where the Japanese go to ask questions about their own language. One of the many places. Would argue that the language resources for Japanese online are, I mean, I don't really have the the breadth of knowledge to make a statement like this, but I would say probably the most impressive and broad in the world. There's just so much. Like if you start Googling a phrase, and if you add any phrase and the word kegel to it, you're going to immediately find like 5 to 10 websites with articles about how to find a polite form of whatever phrase you're looking for. And so being able to recognize that, okay, I'm not understanding this right now. Let me find out if this is a collocation or something like that, or an idiom that I need to kind of become a little bit more familiar with. That's really the first step. And then having the resources on hand to help you find the answer to it. That's the next step. So Gakken, this one that I've got, there's a link to it in the newsletter. It's an excellent option. Kinkyusha also has a good one that I think that's probably the next one I'll be getting. There's an online searchable form of it. That's the one downside for this Gakken one, is that you're forced to kind of look up from the noun as the basis, and then it does have in the index a little bit more in terms of you can look up verbs and see what's going with the specific verbs. So that's a little bit of an option. But I believe the Kinkusha one has an online form that you can get somehow that makes it a little bit more searchable. So definitely a good resource to consider, especially if you're doing a lot of writing in Japanese and want to find some more natural phrasings. So yep, I hope that you guys enjoyed this. Definitely go check out John Wick. It's, I would say, worth it to kind of be completionist about it and see them all, especially because the most recent movie has some shots in Osaka and some parts of Tokyo that are sold to the audience as being in Osaka. But so worth it to kind of to see that, and just because it's a fun enough movie. But yeah, always if you're not going to see subtitled movies in Japan, it's worth it. Sometimes you run into some fun stuff. So thanks again for listening. Let me know if you have any questions. Do you use collocation dictionaries? Do you know what language that was in that YouTube video? Please let me know in the comments, or send an email to howtojapanese@gmail.com. Glad to always answer questions. Good luck for anybody who's applying to the JET program. I think that's soon. I also saw that applications are now open to the IUC, the Inter-University Center for Japanese Language Studies 10-month programs. They're due in January at some point. So if that's something that you're interested in, you need to get working on that for sure. Glad to answer any questions about that if you contact me personally. And yeah, I hope you have a good beginning to the winter season and are wrapping up 2023 comfortably and in style.